Consider the summer of 2013 in New York. June 15th, the death of Seth Kim-Cohen, curator of the first important conceptual art exhibitions. June 20th, the exhibition Ambience opens at Tanya Bonnechter Gallery in Chelsea. June 21st, James Turrell's retrospective opens at the Guggenheim, one of 3 Turrell shows nationwide. June 27th, Robert Irwin's Scrim Veil Black Rectangle Natural Light, initially installed at the Whitney in 1977, is reinstalled. July 28th, Rain Room, the immersive installation by Random International, closes after an 11-week run at MoMA. August 1st, the conceptual sound show The String and the Mirror opens at Lisa Cooley Gallery. August 9th, Turner Prize winner Susan Phillips begins work on the public sound installation Day is Done at Governor's Island. August 10th, Soundings, a contemporary score, MoMA's first major sound show, opens. September 10th, the Metropolitan Museum of Art presents Janet Cardiff's The 40-Part Motet at the Cloisters. October 10th, Tan Lin leads a class at MoMA called Ambient Poetics, an Introduction. Four short months inaugurated by what we might think of as the symbolic end of conceptual art, Siegelhaub's passing, and characterized by an unprecedented embrace of sound and light. If conceptualism signals the end of art, does such ambience signal the end of art? And if so, where would that leave us? Retreating to preconceptual modes of art making and reception? Are we witnessing what Foucault would term an epistemic break? Is this the advent of a new Rancierian aesthetic regime? If so, what comes next? As Hal Foster asks, in lieu of criticality, comes what exactly? Beauty? Affect? Celebration? Any other pills to pop? According to some, the art of the 1960s, most notably uppercase C conceptualism, represents the end of art. This account, proffered most famously by Arthur Danto, suggests that conceptualism ended the traditional definition of art, offering in its place art forms that respond to an entirely distinct set of criteria. Rather than appealing to beauty or form or representation, the art of the 60s becomes an active investigatory tool inserted into the mechanisms of culture, politics, identity, and of art itself. If this account is viable, then how do we make sense of the fact that in this summer of 2013, New York played host to no fewer than 9 exhibitions and events devoted to ambient, immersive environments? Such experiences, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, claim to occupy a space that not only has no need of discourse, but is in fact beyond its reach. After years of discursive interventions, body-based and performance work, institutional critique, and social practice, what are we to make of this widespread turn toward ambience? Needless to say, we don't have time today to fully excavate the collective meaning of these 10 Art World events. Instead, I'll focus on just one, the exhibition Ambient, curated by Tim Griffin. I choose this exhibition for a few reasons. For 7 years, Griffin served as editor-in-chief at Art Forum. His remit would have demanded that he keep his proverbial finger on the art world's pulse. So it would seem difficult and perhaps foolhardy to discount his choice of the word ambient to characterize this work. Initially, I'll adopt Griffin's nomenclature as a provisional description of all this sound and light flooding New York's white cubes. But I'm not accepting it unproblematically. First, we must ask what Griffin hopes to suggest by grouping the work of 12 contemporary artists under the title Ambient. In order to excavate the term as a modifier of art practices, to identify its valences, and to tease out its implications, we'll look at three unique yet interrelated employments of the term ambient. The first of these is Brian Eno's coinage, ambient music in the mid-1970s. Griffin accepts and in fact celebrates many of Eno's claims for ambience in the texts that accompany his exhibition. But as we'll see, many of the works in Griffin's exhibition seem to function more effectively as examples of a competing idea of ambience, that of philosopher Timothy Morton. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we will investigate how Morton's vision of ambience differs from Eno's and Griffin's, and how the tension between these competing employments of the term yield different conclusions about the works to which they might be applied. The press release for Ambient, the exhibition, takes us back to the primal scene of ambience. It's 1975. Brian Eno is confined to his sickbed. The volume of the 18th century harp music playing in his room is too low. Unable to rise to adjust the volume, Eno struggles to make out the music amidst the competing sounds, and Eno discovers a new way to listen. This presented what was for me a new way of hearing music, as part of the ambience of the environment, just as the color of the light and the sound of the rain were part of that ambience. This story functions as the pop complement to John Cage's famous anechoic chamber story, in which Cage enters a silent room at Harvard in 1951 and discovers that he can hear the sound of his own bodily functions. This leads Cage to realize that, in his well-disseminated phrase, there is no such thing as silence. It also leads him to compose the equally seminal 433 the following year. Like Cage, Eno discovers a new aesthetic experience in disavowing the distinction between the foreground, music, and the background, noise. In the press release, Griffin further leverages the liner notes of Eno's discrete music, the source of the sickbed listening story, likening the included signal path diagram to Olafur Eliasson's claim that the work initiates an act of seeing yourself seeing. Eliasson has a number of pieces in the ambient exhibition. Interestingly, James Turrell uses the identical formulation to describe one of the effects of his work. But it's worth testing this analogy between Eno's diagram and Eliasson's and Turrell's notion of seeing yourself seeing. So let's look at the diagram. Eno's signal path starts with a synthesizer. The signal passes through a graphic equalizer and an echo unit before reaching two tape recorders. The first records and the second plays back through a delay return to a combined monitor output. Let's investigate what kinds of perception and awareness are present in the discrete music signal path. Eno's system begins not in passivity nor receptivity, but with an active transmission. In this case, two simple and mutually compatible melodic lines of different duration stored on a digital recall system. That is, two tunes on a silicon chip. There is nothing in this system that enables us to listen to ourselves listening. Discrete music is an album of music, not so different as a species of experience from the pachelbel it samples, nor for that matter from Pink Floyd or Public Enemy. The system alters the listening experience of precisely one listener, Eno. Only he hears the input and the output. Only Eno can listen to himself listening. The rest of us just listen. Rather than being self-reflexive in the conceptual sense of evoking questions about the constitution of object and subject, Eno's system invokes a feedback loop, a compounded perception that merely confirms its own existence. In printing the diagram on the back cover of the album, Eno plays a bit of a shell game with his listeners. The diagram itself is a form of feedback. We see what we hear, and we hear what we see, suggesting both a perception of perception and a kind of experience that is what it is, self-identical, beholden to no precedent, representing nothing and unrepresentable itself. Yet, to experience the self-identicalness of the ambient, we first require the just-so story of the technical exegesis. Griffin's recourse to Eliason's notion of seeing yourself seeing also seems overly optimistic. There is nothing in Eliason's installations nor in Terrell's that sanctions a critical reflexivity. Even the phrase itself, seeing yourself seeing, fails to suggest any making of meaning or putting to use of perceptual input. Instead, it merely feeds signal into a closed system, creating a feedback loop that shrouds source, signal, and circuit. Let's turn our attention now to the exhibition, Ambient. It's easy to see how some of the included works hew to Griffin's account of Eno-esque ambience. 3 of Olafur Eliasson's untitled mirror strip pieces get a darkened room to themselves. Each features a spotlight on a stand, trained on thin strips of mirror leaning against a wall. The light reflects off the mirrors while casting thin zips of shadow on the wall behind. Elsewhere, 2 of Liz Deschennes' photograms, both untitled Charlotte Posaneski, hang in different corners of a single room. One hugs its corners, 2 joined walls, forming a corner of its own. The other spans across the corner's right angle, creating a triangular space between the photogram's plane and those of the walls. These dimly reflective surfaces emit a visual hum, neither signal nor noise. They carry the adjective auratic as comfortably as ambient. But Sherry Levine's 6 black mirrors resist both the auratic and the ambient. These surfaces of polished black glass allow a kind of dark reflection, but in the context of Levine's work, they point away from the kind of self-awareness that Griffin suggests in his press release and toward an art historicity that can't be confused with the here and now of ambient reflexivity. While evoking the various theories and methodologies of the monochrome, they also turn the gallery space, the viewing subject, and all the other works in the room into an art historical tableau vivant, albeit one of somewhat subdued vivacity. Because the reflection is weak, one stands still before the mirror's surfaces, trying to pick out some recognizable form. On the surfaces of Levine's mirrors, this tableau dissolves into a kind of real-time mise en abîme, whose emphasis is most decidedly on the abîme, the abyss of reduced visibility, of curtailed vitality, of constantly deferred self-presence. These These works point away from the perception and the self and towards a cultural art historical awareness. Some of the works in ambient even more fervently resist the Eno Griffin account of ambience. Susan Goldman's paint by numbers pieces, 4 of them, hang in a modest cluster at the top of the stairs in the second floor gallery. They are small. 3 are 10.5 by 14.5, 1 is 16.5 by 20.5 inches. These works start with guidelines already in place, a store-bought paint-by-numbers kit. This most homey and hobbyish of artistic practices is remixed and reimagined by Goldman. She disavows the inherent meaning and method of the paint-by-numbers kit, running it through a kind of machine, subjecting it to the grid that orders and grounds so much modernist art. In Country Scene from 2000, this grid is only suggested but is nevertheless unavoidable. 8 squares run horizontally just below the middle of the canvas. A 9th square that ought to finish the sequence is instead dropped half a square below the sequence of 8 and nudged slightly beneath the rightmost square, upsetting the implied regularity of the grid rhythm. Each of these squares is painted in accordance with the paint-by-numbers outlines, but in decidedly uncalled-for colors: bright greens, fuchsias, garish yellows. The title, Country Scene, is simply a retransmission of the name of this particular paint-by-numbers kit. This name, which in standard usage would have been painted over, is still visible in the unpainted upper left of the canvas. Rather than the bucolic country scene promised by the title, Goldman's squares deliver a rigid psychedelia. Goldman inverts the initial emphasis of the painting. Much of what should have been supplied is omitted. In its absence, however, the guidelines for the amateur painter remain visible. The effect is a version of bearing the device, of allowing the audience to glimpse the mechanism and technique of the artist. This demythifying gesture, first suggested by the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky in the early 1920s, is meant to disrupt the reader's inclination to suspend her disbelief. Rather than sinking into the life world of the fiction, what Clement Greenberg disparaged as pictorial illusionism, the bearing of the device keeps the audience perennially on alert to the manipulations inherent in the artist's stratagem. But of course, the device of paint by numbers is never truly concealed. Any eye can reconstruct the undercarriage that supports the painter's work. And to simply carry out the paint by numbers according to the instructions doesn't situate the painter in the position traditionally reserved for the author or artist of the work. Goldman turns the canvas inside out, twisting and looping it back on itself and on the process that is meant to initiate and guide. This is not the closed-loop feedback of self-sameness, but feedback as the communication of external responses and criticism, as in, I'd like to give you some feedback on this. Its surface transmits a visual code of two vivid grid squares, creating a periodic rhythm. This periodicity does the work of supplying the grid that organizes the rectangular canvas in agreement with the geometrical model of perspective that has ordered the European sense of vision since the 15th century, as Rosalind Krauss has argued. As it nears the end of the canvas, moving like Latinate writing from left to right, the regularity of the painted squares hiccups, upsetting the rhythmic, perceptual, and syntagmatic logic of Goldman's intervention. It's hard to see how all this estrangement and referentiality, this archaeology of the canvas and its organizing principles, could be subsumed under the rubric of ambience. press release for the Ambient exhibition also indicates that Ambience, quote, may usefully be expanded today to supply a model of contemporary ways of looking at art in a post-industrial paradigm. Usefully expanded here presumably refers to a new ethics of interaction with images and objects. This new ethics is predicated on a democratization of the power relations between artist and audience, erasing the hierarchical power granted to the artist. This starts in Eno's sickbed, where he discovers a new mode of aesthetic perception. The artistic material surfs the threshold of perception, mingling with other environmental stimuli. The listener, rather than fighting to discern the former from the latter, accepts their symbiosis. Of course, this is always more or less true. Art never takes place in a vacuum. Listeners and spectators always negotiate the work and its environment. Eno needn't bother to make a new kind of music in order for us to listen this way, but he does. And in so doing, he invents a system that takes individual compositional decisions out of his hands. Instead, he merely selects some basic input and lets the system run. Eno describes it as a system that once set into operation could create music with little or no intervention on my part. For those of us with a little art history under our belts, this claim should strike a familiar chord. The completed work is fundamentally parsimonious and systematically self-exhausting. Mel Bachner, The Serial Attitude, 1967. Though I may have the pleasure of discovering musical processes and composing the musical material to run through them, once the process is set up and loaded, it runs by itself. Steve Reich, Music as a Gradual Process, 1968. The process is mechanical and should not be tampered with. It should run its course. Saul LeWitt, Sentences on Conceptual Art, 1969. Eno suggests that his authorial withdrawal relegates him to the role of an audience to the results. But of course it doesn't. Eno's name. Eno's name. Eno's name. Not yours, not mine, is on the cover. The system's design is his. He has chosen the materials to feed into the system. He has decided whether the results are satisfactory for release. In fact, in his lecture titled The Studio as Compositional Tool, he describes making post-production changes to the recordings prior to release. Perhaps most importantly, Eno is the composer of the creative decision to make music in this manner. But as we noted earlier, in order to listen as Eno suggests, without distinction between foreground and background, we don't need Eno's help. By assuming the privilege of granting us permission and by creating a process to license this listening, Eno reasserts the very authority he claims to abdicate. We all know how the story of capital C conceptual art is usually told. Artists turned away from material concerns, including paradigmatically the mediality of Greenbergian abstract painting, and concerned themselves with the language that motivates, engages, describes, and results from works of art. As Rosalind Krauss wrote in 1979, it is obvious that the logic of the space of postmodernist practice is no longer organized around the definition of a given medium on the grounds of material, or for that matter, the perception of material. It is organized instead through the universe of terms that are felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation. Krauss's description, intended to characterize and promote an expansion of sculptural practice, is itself open to further expansion. To put Krauss's description fully into play, we need to know what constitutes a term. Is it only a dictionary-accredited word? Or might the terms in opposition also include other units? For instance, might we see the various steps of a conventional process as terms capable of productive opposition? Might the moves and countermoves of a given practice's history also be ordered and disordered like terms? What about the expectations of a given audience in a given space? Or the historical, economic, and ideological components of a presentation situation? The specific differences between how one practices and how one engages with terminological oppositions are crucially important. But similarities are also important. One could argue that it is this kind of play with term units that binds some of the most fruitful art practices of the past 45 years. Site-specific practices, institutional critique, performance, process, body art, relational aesthetics, and social practice, just to name one path through the past 5 decades, all engage in the displacement of terms. As a result, they all contribute to what, at the start of this talk, I might have referred to as the long and dispersed history of conceptualism. In his book, Noise, Water, Meat, Douglas Kahn points out that even Cage's primordial experience of pure perception sits on a base of discursivity. Before Cage can hear the sounds of his body in the anechoic chamber, he first must ask, what are those sounds? Ambient aesthetics also relies on a complex of terms evident in the oppositions we've been ticking off. Foreground, background, signal, noise, intention, chance, producer, receiver, agency, awareness, natural, unnatural. Ambience is in fact constituted by this terminological complex. Like all environments, it is only apparently natural and self-identical. So it seems we have two options. To conclude that ambient is simply the wrong adjective to describe these works, or to redefine ambient so as to allow it to be more productively applied to these works and others, perhaps to a broader cultural tendency. So it is here that we turn to Timothy Morton's use of the term ambient. Ambience for Morton is not all-encompassing. It is not, in his words, some kind of fudge. Like Griffin, Morton returns to the primal scene of ambience, Eno's sickbed story. But Morton draws different conclusions about perception and meaning. Morton writes, Eno's gramophone was just barely audible. In the same way ambient poetry makes certain features of reality just perceptible, but nevertheless they are perceptible. This is a minimized degree of speech, not a metaphysical 0 degree, but an infinitesimal degree. Unlike a 0 degree, which emits nothing, the infinitesimal degree always retains a hum of what I will insist on calling signification. And if blending my Morton with my Con, signification indeed is always there, secreted away in the fleshy folds of perception, then its effects must always be constituent parts of any perception of perception. Just as Con identifies a discursive substrate in Cage's silence, Morton detects a murmur of meaning, what Barth might call the rustle of language in Eno's ambience. Rather than immersion, Morton's ambience suggests expenditure, the dispersal of its own ontological status among disparate entities. Morton's ambience sometimes sounds like a form of site specificity. He says, the atmosphere in which the message exists, its ambience, is a significant element of its meaning. In fact, its context is its meaning. Ambience, then, is the activating context of performative statements. The phrase, I do, can mean many things, but it only enters its speaker into marriage when spoken in a specific and recognized context. Meaning emerges relative to and as a result of its context. If we contrast this with the notion of seeing yourself seeing, a few things emerge. Contextual meaning is not a self-reflexive feedback loop. Instead, Morton's formulation acknowledges the complex of terminological oppositions that are content's conditions of possibility. That is to say, content is not self-evident, but only comes into being relative to a specific set of conditions, expectations, and demands. Ambience redefined and reapplied isn't a conflation of foreground and background, nor a reversal of their polarities. Instead, ambience grants access through and beyond and around these entities, troubling the historical, political, and relational encryptions that grant them their meaning. To gather works of art under the banner of Morton's ambience, rather than the one favored by Griffin, allows for radically different practices and responses. This is evident in what Morton presents as an alternative creation myth of ambience. It is 1823, and Thomas de Quincey is out for a walk with William Wordsworth, when de Quincey's mind is, according to Morton, opened to an awareness of ambience. De Quincey writes, "No sound came up through the winding valleys that stretched to the north, and the few cottage lights gleaming at wide distances from recesses amidst the rocky hills had long been extinct." According to Morton, when de Quincey writes the words "no sound," we hear the absence of sound. This is not a figure in ground problem. Rather, it is the presence of absent entities, the presence of absence itself, indicated by, well, by what? By an ever-present absence lurking in the constitution of entities? By a nostalgia for the infinite? By the infinitesimal degree quivering in the superstrings of matter? To be honest, I don't think we need to resort to metaphysics or to quantum physics to sort this out. Just as with Cage's experience in the anechoic chamber and Eno's in his sickbed, the engine powering de Quincey's perceptual machinations is constructed at the infinitesimal degree, a level below, outside, or prior to perception. It is, in a word, discursive. And here today, at this event, I want to offer the following provocation. We have only one additional infinitesimal degree to travel if we want to move from the discursive to the conceptual. For all their evident formal logic, Goldman's paint by numbers pieces are also constructed on and by a conceptual grid of infinitesimal degrees. Only a fundamental generative opposition of terms allows the work to scalpel through the bodies of two distinct artistic practices, confusing and complicating each in turn. The sophistication of grid-based minimalism, think Agnes Martin or Saul LeWitt, begins to echo the rote techniques of paint by numbers. The amateur and the avant-garde display resemblances we had no right to expect. Each constructs itself from a guiding schematic. In the case of paint by numbers, the mass-produced factory schematic is concealed in the final painting, whereas in the case of the minimalist grid, the repressed schematic of Western opticality is revealed. Goldman's canvases create a productive friction by setting their operative traditions against the terms of their own practices and by complicating the binarism that by all accounts should separate them. This is precisely what Morton imagines when he imagines ambience. As a means of coaxing this discussion towards conclusion, allow me to indulge in a little bit of ex post facto curating. I'd like to imagine what it would have meant if a particular work had popped up amidst the shows in question that summer in New York. The piece I have in mind is Johannes Kreidler's 2009 Fremdarbeit. German word for outsourcing. Now, Fremdarbeit is a musical composition, but only to the extent that Goldman's paint by numbers works are formal exercises in painterly abstraction. Insert this work imaginatively into the imaginary summer and into this tone, to gauge and to test the long dispersed history of conceptualism. By examining how music, traditionally considered the most ambient of media, put Morton's conception of ambience into play. He received a €1,500 commission by Fremdarbeit. His first move was not to choose a time signature, but to subcontract the compositional labor to Chinese provided with a number of Kreidler's recent compositions and asked to create something. Was tasked with coding a compositional algorithm that would output a score based on Kreidler's. Again, this connected Kreidler's compositions to statistical analysis, noting that they were 53% linear, 23% linear, the remainder being indefinable. Modern values account for circa 46% of the compositions for alcohol, 39% when Fremdarbeit is performed, Kreidler is present to model, introducing each movement and providing the details of the latest output. What Krauss would call Fremdarbeit's cultural situation, what we, in the art context, might call its site specificity. What Timothy Morton would call its ambience is constituted by a set of terms in opposition. And the tension between these terms are torqued into uncomfortable extremes. Timothy Morton knows that ambience often ignores these inconvenient realities, offering instead what he calls, quote, a soothing panacea for capitalist and technocratic alienation. As examples, he cites New Age music and the Beethoven that masks the screams at Auschwitz. But he also detects this darker ambience in the techno-capitalist romance of the non-place. He calls them sites of environmental suffering, including lawns, huge vacant parking lots, gigantic airport concourses, the Rauschenberg cracked black of tarmac, nuclear radiation, or global warming itself. We might add to his list the Contemporary Art Museum. Ambience too often appeals to a nostalgia for the underdetermined signification of such spaces, depoliticized, non-discursive, non-places, atopias promising utopia. The work on view in the summer of 2013 in New York functions as the fulfillment of such a promise made long ago by artists like Turrell and Irwin. This ambient promise rests on the belief that there is a fundamental truth in perception, a reality that is what it is, self-identical, that has no need of context, is beholden to no precedent, independent of any relation. The allure of ambience is the lure of an ontological certainty confirmed in and by perception. This is what is conjured when Turrell and Eliason speak of seeing yourself seeing. But there are two problems with this. One, as Hal Foster writes, is that the reflexivity of seeing oneself see approaches its opposite, a space that seems to do the perceiving for us. This is a new version of the old problem of fetishization, for it takes our thoughts and sensations, processes them as images and effects, and delivers them back to us for our appreciative amazement. The second problem is that this fetishization of perception denies the socio-historic context upon which any making sense of perception depends. If there is still some value to the adjective ambient as a qualifier of experience, artistic or otherwise, it must acknowledge that Cage's experience and Eno's and Eliason's and Turrell's are all validated and propelled by discursive forces, by Morton's infinitesimal degree, by Krauss's terms in opposition, by Kahn's third internal sound. Like everything else, ambience is an output of cultural processes, of economic conditions, technological innovations, geopolitical discord and concord, of the machinations of art history and of history writ large. Ambient rides the narrative wave of its own inception, at least that is, until the wave crashes.